E a village where the sun paints the earth in shades of gold, two lives were once woven together by a love that seemed eternal. She was his peace, e he was her promise. But even the deepest roots can be severed by the sharp edge of ambition. When a man decides that the glitter of a stranger's wealth is worth more than the loyalty of a lifetime, a journey of betrayal begins. This is a story of choices matching the dark in the night that eventually reveals every truth. It is a tale of a man who thought he could outrun his past, only to find that destiny is the most patient of hunters. Before the path of this broken promise is fully revealed and the true cost of greed is laid bare, take a moment to join this community by subscribing. If you believe that every action has its own echo and that justice always finds its way, hit the notification bell so you never miss a chapter. Have you ever seen someone trade a heart of gold for a pocket full of stones? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments. Every story told that is a lesson for you all. Now, witness how a life built on shadows begins to crumble. The sun rose over the village of Kibera, casting a warm, amber glow upon the clay huts in the swaying acacia trees. In this corner of the world, life moved to the rhythm of the seasons and the beating of the heart. A young woman walked through the morning mist, her movements fluid and graceful, carrying a basket of fresh greens. Her smile was a quiet light that seemed to comfort everyone she passed. To those who knew her, she was the soul of the village, a person whose kindness was as reliable as the dawn. Beside her walked a man with eyes that often wandered toward the distant horizon, looking past the beauty of the moment in search of something he could not yet name. For years, they had been inseparable, their lives intertwined like the threads of a finely woven kente cloth. They shared dreams under the vast African sky, whispering of a future where their children would run through these same fields. He promised her that his hands would build her a home that would stand against any storm, and she promised him a love that would never wither. In the simplicity of their daily toil, there was a profound peace. But as the man's ambition began to grow, that peace started to feel like a cage. He watched the merchant caravans pass through with their silken spices, and abter-se van in the fertile soil of his restless mind. One afternoon, a lavish carriage arrived, belonging to a powerful merchant from the city. Beside him sat his daughter, a woman draped in shimmering fabrics and heavy jewels that caught the light like fallen stars. Her presence was a sharp contrast to the humble village, and the man found himself unable to look away. He saw in her not a person, but a gateway to the life he craved, a life where he would no longer have to sweat under the sun for a handful of grain. The merchant noticed the man's enthusiasm and saw an opportunity to gain a strong, hungry worker who could be easily manipulated by the promise of his status and wealth. The man began to spend his evenings away from the woman he loved, lingering near the merchant as he camped instead. He listened to stories of marble floors, endless feasts, and the power that came with a heavy purse. The simple joy of the village started to look like poverty to him, and the woman's gentle laughter began to sound like a reminder of everything he wanted to leave behind. He convinced himself that he was destined for greatness and that staying in the village was a waste of his potential. The whispers of the merchant's daughter promised him a seat at the table of kings, provided he was willing to shed his old life like a snake sheds its skin. The confrontation happened beneath the great baobab tree as the moon began to rise. The woman could sense the distance see his soul before he even spoke a word. She reached for his hand, but he pulled away, his face hardened by a cold, new determination. He told her that he was leaving with the caravan at dawn, that the merchant had offered him a position of high authority in a marriage that would secure his fortune. He spoke of goldy influence as if they were the only things that mattered, refusing to look into her eyes where the reflection of their shared past was breaking into 1,000 jagged pieces. She did not scream or plead, though her heart felt as if each were being torn from her chest. Instead, she stood tall, her voice steady despite the trembling in her spirit. She told him that gold could buy a palace, but it could never buy back a soul once it had been traded for greed. She warned him that the wealth of a stranger is a heavy chain and that the man she loved would never abandon his roots for the glitter of a fleeting dream. He scoffed at her words, dismissing her wisdom as the jealousy of someone who could not understand his vision. He walked away into the shadows, leaving her alone under the silent watch of the ancestors. The next morning, as the first light touched the peaks of the distant hills, the caravan prepared to depart. Demur dressed himself in a new tunic provided by the merchant, feeling the weight of the fabric and the pride of his new station. He did not look back at the small hut where he had spent so many happy years. He did not look for the woman who stood at the edge of the village, watching through a veil of silent tears. He boarded the carriage with the merchant as a daughter, his mind filled with images of the city and the riches that awaited him. He felt like a conqueror, unaware that he was actually a prisoner of his own vanity. As the dust from the caravan settled, the village returned to its usual routine, but a shadow remained where the Pricee presence used to be. The woman went back to her work, her heart heavy but her spirit unbroken. She found solace in the earthy community, turning her pain into a quiet strength. She became a student of the elders, learning the secrets of the plants and the stories of those who had walked the path of trial before her. While Demur was learning the cold language of queens in contracts in the city, she was discovering the infinite wealth of a resilient soul and the power of a heart that refuses to hate. In the city, the Pricee rise was rapid. He learned to navigate the treacherous waters of trade and the fickle nature of the elite. He married the merchant as a daughter in a ceremony that was more about business than love, surrounded by people who valued him only for what he could bring to their coffers. He lived in a house of stone with servants at his beck and call, yet he often found himself staring at the moon, wondering why the air in the city felt so thin. He had the world at his feet, but he was starting to realize that when you stand on a mountain of gold, the wind is much colder and there is no one to catch you if you slip. 5 years passed, and Demur had become a master of his craft, known for his ruthlessness in his obsession with accumulating money. He had forgotten the sound of the woman's voice and the smell of the village rain. He believed he had won, that his choice had been justified by the sheer volume of his possessions. But the higher one climbs on a ladder built of lies and broken promises, the more fragile the foundation becomes. Deep in the heart of the village, the woman looked at the horizon and whispered a prayer for the man who had lost himself, knowing that the debt of a broken heart is always collected, and the price is often more than any man can afford to pay. The golden towers of the city began to lose their luster as the seasons turned, and there inside the great stone house grew heavy with unspoken resentment. The man who had traded his soul for status now walked through a house that felt like a tomb, his footsteps echoing against marble that offered no warmth. His wife, the merchant's daughter, looked at him not with love, but with the cold calculation of a creditor. She demanded more jewels, more influence, and more blood from his fading strength to maintain her lavish lifestyle. Every time he looked into her eyes, he saw a mirror of his own greed, reflecting a life that was hollow at its core, a gilded cage where the birds no longer sang. In the village, the woman he had abandoned had become a beacon of hope, a healer whose hands brought comfort to the weary and the broken. She had transformed her grief into a quiet power, standing tall like a baobab tree that had survived the harshest drought. Her garden was a sanctuary of medicinal herbs, and her words were a balm for the restless spirits of the community. She lived simply, but her wealth was measured in the respect and love of those around her, a currency that did not fluctuate with the market. While Demur the city grew poorer in spirit despite his riches, she grew richer in wisdom despite her lack of gold. A sudden darkness fell upon the Pricee business empires when the great trade route was severed by conflict. The sea claimed his most valuable ships. One by one, the men he called friends vanished into the shadows, leaving him to face the rising tide of debt alone. His servants fled when the silver stopped flowing, and the great feasts were replaced by the silence of an empty larder. He turned to his wife for comfort, but she was already packing her trunks, her eyes filled with a sharp, jagged scorn. She told him that she was the daughter of a king and had no room in her life for a beggar whose luck had finally run dry. The day of the final reckoning came when the city guards arrived to seize the house and everything within its walls. Demur stood on the threshold, watching as his silky hobbies were replaced with the rags of his former life. He reached out to touch the hand of the woman he had married for gold, but she pushed him aside with a sneer of disgust. She left with her father as guards, returning to a life of luxury that he was no longer a part of. He studied the dust of the street, a stranger in a city that had once bowed to his name, realizing that the ladder he had climbed was made of nothing but smoke. Humiliation was a bitter bread that he was forced to eat as he began the long journey back toward the routes he had tried to bearing. He walked along the same dusty paths where the merchant as caravan had once carried him in triumph, but now his feet were blistered, his spirit was crushed. The weight of his choices was heavier than any stone, the memories of his betrayal haunted every step he took under the unforgiving sun. He saw the faces of those he had stepped on to reach the top, their silent judgment followed him like a shadow that would not fade even in the dark of night. As he neared the village of Kibera, his heart hammered against his ribs with a mixture of hope and devastating shame. He feared that the earth itself would reject him, and that the ancestors would close their eyes to his desperate need for shelter. He looked at his reflection in a small stream he barely recognized, the mirror staring back a hollow shell of the youth who had once dreamed of greatness. He realized that he had spent 5 years chasing a ghost, only to find that the ghost was now the only thing left of his identity. He approached the village at dusk, hiding in the tall grass like a wounded animal. The village looked exactly as he remembered, yet each felt entirely different through the lens of his new perspective. The sound of children laughing and the smell of roasting maize brought tears to his eyes, a physical ash for a world he had discarded for a lie. He saw the woman he had loved standing in the center of a circle of elders, her presence commanding a respect that no amount of gold could ever buy. She looked beautiful in her simplicity, a queen of the earth who needed no crown of silver to prove her worth. He wanted to call out her name, but the word died in his throat, choked by the sheer magnitude of his regret. He collapsed near the edge of her garden, his strength failing him as the fever of exhaustion took hold of his body. He lay amongst the herbs she had planted, the scent of lavender sage filling his senses reminding him of a peace he had long since forgotten. He expected to be driven away with stones and curses, for he knew that he deserved nothing less than the coldest of welcomes. He closed his eyes and prayed for the darkness to take him, unable to bear the thought of seeing the disappointment in her eyes one last time. He was a man with no home, no love, and no hope. But a cool hand touched his brow, and the bitterness of the world seemed to soften for a brief, flickering moment. He opened his eyes to see her looking down at him, her face a mask of quiet contemplation as she assessed his tattered clothes and his hollow cheeks. There was no anger in her gaze, only a deep, profound sadness that hurt more than any sharp word ever could. She did not ask him where his gold had gone or why he had returned to the place he had once scorned. She simply lifted a cup of water to his parched lips and whispered that even the most lost of travelers must eventually find their way back to the truth. She brought him into her home, not as her husband, but as a broken soul in need of the very mercy he had once refused to show. He wept as she cleaned his wounds, the salt of his tears mixing with the water she used to wash the dust of the city from his skin. The villagers watched from a distance, their murmurs a reminder of the price he would have to pay to earn back the trust he had shattered. He realized then that redemption was not a gift to be received, but a mountain to be climbed, and that the first step he was acknowledging that he was no longer a conqueror, but a student of the heart. The morning light filtered through the thatched roof, revealing the stark reality of a man who had returned with nothing but the scars of his own making. He awoke not to the sound of servants, but to the rhythmic thumping of a mortar passed away the distance. The woman was already at work, her hands busy with the healing plants that had become her life's purpose. She did not offer him words of comfort or promises of a restored past. She offered him a bowl of simple porridge and a wooden hoe. The message was clear. In this village, value was not measured by what one possessed, but by the sweat of one's brow and the sincerity of one's contribution to the collective spirit. He walked into the fields, his hands softly unaccustomed to the rough wood of the tools. The sun, which he had once viewed from the shade of a silky canopy, now beat down upon his neck with an unforgiving intensity. The other villagers moved with a synchronized grace, their voices rising in songs that spoke of endurance and communal strength. When he tried to join their work, they moved away in silence, their eyes reflecting a memory of the day he had looked down upon them from a merchant as a carriage. He realized that physical labor was the easiest part of his penance. The true weight lay in the cold wall of isolation he had built with his own hands. Days turned into weeks, and the Pricee pride began to crumble under the weight of his exhaustion and the silence of his neighbors. He spent his evenings sitting by the fire, watching the woman marvel with a quiet dignity that he had never truly appreciated when he called her his own. She spoke to him only of the work that needed to be done, treating him with the same detached kindness she showed to any stranger in need. He wanted to tell her of the nights he had spent in the city regretfully thinking of her, but he knew his words were hollow cries in a place that only accepted the currency of action. A great trial came to the village when a mysterious blight began to wither the crops, threatening the very survival of the people. The elders gathered in a circle of worry, their traditional prayers met with a sky that remained stubbornly dry and a soil that turned to dust. Dimmer, having spent years in the city studying the logistics of trade and the science of irrigation to increase his former father-in-law's yields, saw a solution that the village had never considered. He knew how to divert the distant stream through a series of clay pipes and trenches, but he feared that his voice would be heard as nothing more than the arrogance of a ghost. He approached the woman in the stillness of the night, laying out his plan on the dirt floor of the hut with charcoal lines and smooth stones. He explained the slope of the land and the pressure of the water, speaking not with the boastful tone of a master, but with the desperate hope of a servant. She listened in silence, her dark eyes searching his face for any trace of the greed that had once consumed him. After a long silence, she took his hand, the first time she had touched him with intention since his return. He told him that a Pricee knowledge is only a gift if each is given without the expectation of a reward. The next morning, she stood before the elders and presented the plan as a collaborative effort, a way for the village to reclaim its future from the parchment. The men were skeptical, looking at the man with narrowed eyes, but their desperation for water eventually outweighed their hunger for retribution. For 7 days and 7 nights, the man led the work, digging alongside the very people he had once despised. He did not seek the shade, nor did he complain when his hands bled and his muscles screamed in protest. He was no longer a merchant or a husband. He was a builder, carving a path for life to return to the place he had betrayed. When the first trickle of water finally reached the village square, cooling the parched earth and filling the dry basins, a cheer rose up that shook the very leaves of the baobab tree. The children danced in the mud, and the elders nodded in somber approval, recognizing that the man had used his sitting learned skills to serve the people rather than himself. He stood at the edge of the celebration, his clothes caked in dirt, and his face weary, but for the first time in 5 years, the air did not feel thin. He felt a sense of belonging that no marble floor could ever provide, a quiet realization that power is found in the ability to sustain, not to hoard. The woman approached him as the sun began to set, handing him a clean cloth to wipe the mud from his brow. She told him that the village had decided he could stay, not as a guest, but as a member of the community with a permanent place at the communal fire. He looked at her and asked if she could ever find it in her heart to love the man he had become. She smiled, a sadly beautiful expression that contained the wisdom of 1,000 lifetimes. He told him that the man she loved had died the day the caravan left, but the man standing before her was someone she was willing to get to know. Redemption did not come as a sudden burst of light, but as a slow steady growth, much like the crops that began to flourish once more in the village fields. The man continued their work, using his mind and his hands to improve the lives of those around him. He taught the youths how to read the patterns of trade to protect their own interests, he assisted the woman in her healing, learning the names of the plants that could mend a broken body just as he was mending his own spirit. He was no longer the arrogant Jafari of the titles. He was simply a man who had found his way home through the long, hard road of humility. Years later, when the man looked at his reflection in the village stream, he saw a face lined with the marks of labor and the peace of a clear conscience. He lived in a humble hut, but his heart was a palace of memórias and shared joys. Beside him stood the woman, his partner in all things, her presence a constant reminder that the most precious things in life are those that cannot be bought or sold. They watched the sunset together, two souls woven back into a seagull cloth, proving to all who heard their story that while gold may glitter, only the light of a sincere heart can truly show the way through the dark. As the seasons blended into one another, the village of Kibera flourished under the innovative irrigation system the Mer had built. The once parched fields were now a tapestry of vibrant greens in deep washes, providing more than enough for every family to feast. The Mer had earned a new kind of reputation, not one of feared wealth, but of quiet reliability. He was the first to rise and the last to leave the fields, his hands now callously stained by the very earth he once sought to escape. Yet, despite the respect he had regained, a heavy silence still lingered between him and the woman when the sun dipped below the horizon, a reminder that broken trust leaves scars that even the most fertile soil cannot easily hide. A letter arrived one humid afternoon, brought by a weary traveler from the city who had been searching for the man who once lived in a palace of stone. It was a legal notice, a remnant of his former life, stating that a small portion of his seized assets had been cleared of debt and restored to his name. It was not the fortune he once had, but it was enough to return to the city and start again, to buy a modest house and live a life of comfort far away from the physical demands of the village. The news spread through the village like a wildfire in the dry grass, and the whispers began to grow. Would the man who had tasted the sweetness of gold be able to resist its lurid second chime? He stood at the edge of the village, clutching the parchment in his trembling hand, looking toward the distant horizon where the city lights used to beckon like a siren's song. The woman watched him from the doorway of her healing hut, her expression unreadable, though her heart felt the familiar rush of an impending goodbye. She did not ask him to stay, nor did she remind him of the progress he had made mending his spirit. She knew that for his redemption to be true, the choice had to be entirely his own, made without the pressure of guilt or the tether of obligation. The village held its breath, waiting to see if the roots he had planted were deep enough to hold him through this final storm. That evening, he sat by the communal fire, the parchment resting on his knee like a heavy weight. The elders watched him closely, searching for the glint of green they had seen 5 years prior, but they found only a man lost in a labyrinth of reflection. He remembered the cold marble floors and the wife who had looked at him like a business transaction. He compared those memories to the warmth of the village fire and the genuine smiles of the children who now called an uncle. He realized that the city offered him a life of being someone, while the village offered him the chance to be himself. The gold was a mask, but the mud on his boots was the truth. In the middle of the night, he walked to the center of the square where the new water fountain flowed steadily, a symbol of the village's rebirth. He looked at the parchment one last time, reading the numbers that promised a life of easy shadows. Without a word, he tore the paper into 100 tiny pieces and watched as the wind carried them into the flowing water, sending them downstream toward the valley. He felt a sudden lightness in his chest, a release from the last chain that connected him to the arrogant Jafari. He was no longer a man waiting for a chance to go back. He was a man who had finally decided to be where he was. The next morning, the woman found him in the garden, meticulously tending to the young herbs that were used to treat the village as elders. He didn't mention the letter, and neither did she, but the atmosphere between them had shifted. The cold wall of silence had begun to melt into a gentle, unspoken understanding. He began to share stories of his time in the city, not to brag, but to warn the village youths about the traps of vanity and the hollow nature of wealth without purpose. He turned his greatest shame into his most powerful teaching, using his past as a map to guide others away from the cliffs he had once fallen over. A group of merchants passed through Quibera-Uiclater, offering him a chance to act as a middleman for their trade, promising a high commission for his expertise. They spoke of the city's growth and the new opportunities furthermore of his intellect. In the past, he would have jumped at the chance to regain his status, but now he simply smiled and declined. He told them that he was a farmer and a builder, and that his wealth was already overflowing in the granaries of his neighbors. The merchants left in confusion, unable to understand how a man who had known the peak of luxury could find satisfaction in the simplicity of a clay-walled life. As he worked alongside the woman in the healing hatch, he began to learn the deeper language of the plants, understanding that true healing requires patience and time. He saw how she cared for the sick, not for praise, but because their pain was her own. He realized that during all those years in the city, he had been the sickest man of all, suffering from a blindness that prevented him from seeing the value of a human soul. He began to apologize in not one grand gesture, but 1,000 small acts of service, mending the fences of those he had ignored, listening to the stories of those he had once deemed beneath him. The village elders eventually invited him to sit in their circle, a gesture of ultimate acceptance that moved him to tears. They asked for his advice on how to protect the village's resources and how to ensure that the prosperity they had built would last for generations. He spoke with a newfound humility, emphasizing that the strength of the village lay not in its surplus of grain, but in the strength of its bonds. He was no longer an outsider performing a penance. He had become a pillar of the community, a man whose wisdom was sought because each had been forged in the fire of failure. The chapter ends with the man and the woman sitting on the bench he had built outside her hutch, watching the sun set over the horizon. For the first time, he reached out and took her hand. In this time, she did not pull away. They sat in a comfortable silence. Two people who had survived a great storm found their way to a quiet shore. The city was a distant memory, a ghost of a life that no longer had any power over him. They were ready to face the final chapter of their lives together, knowing that the greatest wealth is a heart that has finally found its way home. The seasons turned into decades, and the once restless man became the oldest elder in Quibera. His hair had turned the color of the cotton clouds, and his face was a map of every struggle and every victory he had experienced. He sat under the same great baobab where he had once broken a heart, but now he was surrounded by grandchildren who climbed on his knees and begged for stories of the old days. He told them not of golden cities, but of the soil, the water, and the importance of keeping one's word. Beside him sat the woman, her hand resting naturally in his, their lives having grown together like two vines that had become a single, imbricable trunk. The village had transformed into a center of learning and healing, known far across the plains for its wisdom and its abundance. People traveled from distant lands to see the irrigation systems that had never failed and to visit the woman whose garden held a cure for almost every ailment. The Mai woman never asked for payment in silver. They asked only that those they helped pass the kindness along to someone else. They had built a legacy that was not written in stone or kept in a vault, but lived in the hearts of every person who called the village home. They had proven that a community's true strength is found in how each treats its most vulnerable members. One evening, a young man from the village approached them, his eyes bright with a dangerous ambition that the old man recognized all too well. The youth spoke of the city's new industries and his desire to leave the slowness of the village behind to seek a fortune that would make him a king among men. The elders watched in silence, waiting to see how the old man would respond to a mirror of his own past. He didn't scold the boy or forbid him from leaving. Instead, he reached into a small wooden box and pulled out a single, smooth stone from the village stream and a handful of dry dust from the road. He told the youth that the city is a place of mirrors where a man can easily lose sight of his own reflection. He explained that wealth without a foundation is like the dust in his hand easily scattered by the slightest wind, but a life built on service and integrity is like the stone, solid and enduring. He shared the secret he had learned through so much pain, that the world will always try to tell you that you are not enough until you own everything, but the truth is that you are only enough when you give everything. The youth looked at the old man's scarred hands and then at the peaceful village, and for the first time, he saw the riches that were already his. As the sun began its final descent, painting the sky deep purples and burning oranges, the old man felt a profound sense of completion. He looked at the woman who had been his compass, his teacher, and his greatest love. He thanked her for the mercy she had shown him when he deserved none, and for the life they had built together in the ashes of his pride. She smiled. Her eyes still held that same quiet light he had first seen a lifetime ago. He told him that she had never stopped believing the man he was meant to be. They had lived a story that would be told for generations, a story of a man who found himself by losing his way. That night, a grand festival was held to celebrate the anniversary of the water's return. The entire village gathered to eat, dance, in honor of the ancestors. The man and woman sat in the place of honor, watching as the younger generation took up the songs and the traditions they had protected. There was no mention of the arrogant Jafari, the abandoned wife. There was only the builders of the stream. They had successfully rewritten their own narrative, replacing a tragedy of betrayal with a masterpiece of redemption. The air was filled with the scent of jasmine and the sound of drums, a symphony of a people who knew exactly who they were. When the festivities died down, the village fell into a peaceful slumber. The couple walked slowly back to their hut. They stood for a moment at the threshold, looking out at the fields that glowed softly under the light of a full moon. The man felt a gentle tug on his spirit, a realization that his journey was nearing its natural end. He wasn't afraid, for he knew that he was leaving the world better than he found it. He had repaid his debt to the earth and to the woman, and his soul was finally at peace, as clear and steady as the water that flowed through the village pipes. The following morning, the villagers found the old man sitting in his favorite chair facing the sunrise, a peaceful smile frozen on his lips. He had passed away in his sleep, a man who died with empty pockets but a heart so full each could have powered the sun. The woman sat beside him, dry-eyed and calm, for she knew that death was not a wall but a doorway. She knew that he hadn't truly left. He had simply become part of the wind that has led the crops and the water that can shade the village as it thirsts. He had finally achieved the only kind of immortality that actually matters. The village mourned him not with wailing, but with a week of service, honoring his memory by finishing the projects he had started. They buried him beneath the great baobab tree, and beside his grave, they placed a simple plaque that read, "It lies a man who learned that the shortest path to heaven is through the dirt of the earth." The woman continued her work for many years, her presence a constant reminder of the power of forgiveness. When her time eventually came, she was laid to rest beside him, their spirits finally reunited in the silent, eternal dance of the ancestors. The story of the arrogant man and the wise woman became a cornerstone of African folklore, spreading far beyond the borders of Kibera. It was told in the markets of the Great Rift Valley and in the courts of the northern kingdoms. It served as a reminder to every restless soul that the grass is not greener on the other side, but where you water it. And so, the legacy of Nalin Jafari lived on, a timeless tale of how a broken heart can heal a broken man, and how the greatest wealth of all is simply the courage to come home.